Before ride-sharing apps, before traffic lights, even before cars themselves, there were taxis. From horse-drawn streets to glowing city skylines, the taxicab has carried people through centuries of change. Let's take a ride through its history. Did you know the taxicab's lineage begins in the 17th century when Europe's growing capitals needed more predictable ways to move people who lacked private horses or staff? In London, enterprising coach owners began offering hackney rides by the early 1600s, and the service took root quickly enough that authorities soon tried to impose order. Early licensing and the establishment of designated stands were not merely bureaucratic gestures, they represented a first attempt to balance private enterprise with public space and safety. Across the channels, Paris developed its own culture of carriages for hire, one that would later give the industry its defining vocabulary. Before meters, pricing was haphazard and contentious, hinging on the negotiation prowess of the passenger and the whim or local custom of the driver. Disputes were common because time, distance, waiting, weather, and traffic all complicated what a fair fare ought to be. The critical breakthrough came when inventors devised devices to measure time and distance with enough accuracy to standardize payment, culminating in Wilhelm Bruhn's 1891 patent for the modern taximeter. The meter did more than solve a pricing problem, it established the technological substrate for regulation, trust, and scale, an instrument that governments could certify and that passengers could see, making a taxi a quasi-public utility while remaining privately operated. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the internal combustion engine redefined urban convenience. Horse-drawn carriages suffered from limited range and speed, high upkeep, and severe sanitation issues, while motor vehicles promised faster trips and cleaner streets. In 1897, the first gasoline taxicab fitted with a meter appeared in Stuttgart, a proof of concept that spread quickly through Europe's capitals, where density made motorized for hire vehicles economically viable. The taxi became a symbol of modernity, a machine at your command, available without ownership, aligning with the rhythms of city life and the increasingly clock-governed nature of work and leisure. New York seized on the idea in the early 1900s, a time when its population and economic power were exploding. In 1907, businessman Harry N. Allen founded the New York Taxicab Company after becoming frustrated with what he considered the abusive pricing of horse cab drivers. He imported a fleet of red gasoline-powered cabs from France, though these were soon replaced with bright yellow vehicles, inspired by a university study suggesting yellow was the most visible color from long distances. This choice would eventually give rise to one of the most iconic images in American urban culture, the New York yellow cab. Throughout the early 20th century, motorized taxis became a symbol of modernity and increasingly dominated the streets of major cities worldwide. The early decades of motor taxi proliferation revealed an enduring tension. Left entirely to market forces, the supply of cabs could surge beyond what streets and passengers could support, degrading safety and reliability. Over-regulated systems, on the other hand, risked scarcity and higher prices. New York's 1937 medallion system was a decisive experiment in scarcity by design. By limiting the number of licensed taxis and tying operating rights to tradable medallions, the city stabilized supply but also created a financial asset whose value would rise with demand. In boom times, medallions soared in price, creating barriers to entry and pushing many drivers to lease rather than own. Similar caps emerged worldwide in various forms: numeric limits, territorial exclusivity, fare controls, and vehicle standards. The medallion model implicitly treated the cab industry like a managed commons where stability and quality were prioritized over unbounded competition. It also hinted at a deeper political economy, the city's promise of predictable service in exchange for a controlled market and compliance with safety, training, and consumer protection rules. The long-run effect was a dual structure in many cities: corporate fleets with economies of scale and independent owner-operators who treated the medallion as both a livelihood and an approaching investment. Mid-century technology recast taxis as information systems. The introduction of two-way radios transformed taxi companies into real-time dispatch networks. capable of smoothing out spatial mismatches between riders and cabs. Before radios, drivers cruised and clustered in high-demand areas, a pattern that left neighborhoods underserved and wasted fuel and time. Radio dispatchers, backed by maps and local knowledge, could steer drivers to calls and balance load across the fleet. Over time, computerized dispatch refined the process, introducing basic forms of algorithmic matching. The taxi thus became not only a vehicle business but also an early data business, with operators implicitly solving a citywide routing problem in which marginal minutes mattered. These systems did not erase the street hail, an essential convenience and cultural ritual, but they professionalized the back office and planted the seeds for later software-driven revolutions. From a passenger's vantage point, the meter symbolized fair dealing, while the carriage or car became a space or brief transactional intimacy. Passengers entered a stranger's vehicle, trusting it in a combination of visible instrumentation, municipal licensing, and the cultural weight of the cab's livery and signage. Drivers, in turn, relied on the meter to legitimize their labor minute by minute. Gratuities over time evolved into expected supplements in some regions, while in others tipping remained rare or regulated. The privacy of a cab ride, conversation optional, destination confidential, helped embed taxis in urban folklore and storytelling. They ferried business people to train stations, families to hospitals, and revelers home after midnight. The experience varied by city. In London, knowledge-tested black cab drivers cultivated a reputation for mastery of the street grid. In Paris, style mixed with formality. In New York, speed and attitude became part of the brand. Everywhere, though, the taxi's promise was consistent: your time traded for a fare under a watchful meter. Each global capital adapted the taxi to its geography, institutions, and culture. London's black cabs, with their turning radius and accessible cabins, were sculpted by the city's medieval street plan and standards that prize maneuverability and passenger comfort. The knowledge, a demanding test of London's streets and landmarks, elevated driving into a craft and gave the city's taxis a reputation for reliability and expertise. Paris's taxis, rooted in the same continental tradition that coined the taximeter, reflected both regulation and fashion, blending formal service with a distinctly Parisian aesthetic of understated uniformity. New York's yellow cabs, deployed on a rectilinear grid, optimized for velocity and visibility, a practical response to the city's scale and an emblem of its ceaseless motion. Tokyo's taxi ecosystem, precise and courteous, layered etiquette atop technology, offering door automation features and immaculate interiors that echoed Japan's broader service ethos. These differences are not superficial. They express how each city understands the relationship between public space, private enterprise, and the rider's dignity. Outside Europe and North America, taxis evolved amid different infrastructures and market constraints. In Mumbai, black and yellow Fiats and later compact sedans formed a backbone of everyday mobility alongside an immense suburban rail network, auto rickshaws, and buses. In Nairobi, a flexible ecosystem of taxis intersected with matatus, the private-run minibuses whose route flexibility and cultural vibrancy filled gaps in formal transit. Sao Paulo and Mexico City developed taxi systems that had to contend with vast sprawl and heavy congestion, worsening the economics of cruising and making dispatch and neighborhood-based service crucial. In many cities across the global south, informal services, three-wheelers, and motorcycle taxis coexist with conventional four-door cabs, blurring the boundaries between categories and underscoring how taxi is more a function, on-demand, point-to-point service than a single vehicle class. Driving a taxi has long offered a pathway into urban labor markets for immigrants and newcomers. The job demands navigation skills, endurance, and interpersonal savvy. It also confers a degree of autonomy rare in wage work. In many cities, driver demographics map onto migration patterns. New arrivals drive to build capital, learn the city, and assemble networks, while some remain to become owners, mentors, or dispatchers. Yet taxi labor also bears risks: long hours, exposure to street crime and accidents, volatile incomes tied to weather and events, and debt burdens for those who bought medallions at peak valuations. The taxi thus embodies both the promise and precarity of urban entrepreneurship. The evolution of lease balancing models, daily, weekly, or shift-based, shaped driver leverage and share of fares, while regulation around shifts, rest breaks, and vehicle safety attempted to mediate competing pressures of productivity and well-being. The rise of the digital age in the early 21st century brought profound disruptions to the taxi industry. Beginning around 2009, smartphone-based ride-hailing services such as Uber, Lyft, Didi, and Grab emerged, offering a radically different model built around on-demand digital ordering, GPS-based navigation, algorithmic pricing, and cashless payment systems. These services introduced new norms for transparency. Passengers could see their drivers' identities and ratings, track vehicles on digital maps in real time, receive fare estimates before booking, and pay automatically through the app. The result was a major shift in customer expectations and behavior. Traditional taxi industries, which had relied for decades on street hails, dispatch radios, and regulatory monopolies, suddenly faced intense competition. Many responded by launching their own apps and modernizing their fleets, while cities around the world debated new regulatory approaches, balancing innovation with fairness and safety. The smartphone compressed dispatch payment, navigation, and ratings into a single personal interface, and in doing so, rewired expectations. Platform-based ride-hailing reframed drivers as users of a marketplace rather than employees of a fleet, and passengers as subscribers to a service that abstracted away cash and haggling. Real-time GPS replaced radio guidance, surge pricing sought to signal scarcity and pull more supply to hotspots. Ratings promised accountability on both sides of the transaction. For traditional taxis, this shift was existential. Their long-standing privileges, street hail rights, medallion scarcity, interacted uneasily with software that could summon a car from anywhere. Regulatory response varied from strict enforcement or legacy rules to new hybrid regimes that folded app-based drivers into safety, insurance, and background check requirements. Many taxi fleets adopted apps of their own, integrated with meters and existing dispatch systems, and some jurisdictions created open data standards to level the digital playing field. The result is a patchwork equilibrium. In some cities, taxis and platforms coexist and occasionally interoperate. In others, legal battles or policy resets have redrawn the market from scratch. In the 20th century, meter measured distance and time. The 21st century meter is algorithm. Prices now reflect not just the duration and length of a trip, but also predicted demand, driver availability, and even weather patterns. This dynamism offers theoretical efficiency, more cars when you need them, lower prices off-peak, but invites concerns about opacity and fairness. Passengers who once watched a ticking meter now watched a quoted price that can move quickly, while drivers face pay structures that shift with the bonuses, acceptance rates, and platform policies. Some cities have tried to import dynamic ideas into the taxi world with regulated surge caps or hybrid fare models that complement metered rates with real-time components. The deeper question in governance: how to ensure transparent, non-discrimination pricing in markets where the meter is a black box model rather than a sealed mechanical instrument on the dashboard. Safety has always been central to the taxi's social license. Licensing, vehicle inspections, background checks, and visible identification built a safety scaffold that made getting into a stranger's car feel socially acceptable. The app era layered additional tools, GPS breadcrumbs, shareable trip links, and emergency buttons, but also introduced new concerns about screening consistency and recourse. Accessibility advanced as cities mandated wheelchair-accessible vehicles, audible and visual alerts, and training, yet progress remains uneven and often underfunded. Equity, too, remains a live issue. Historically, taxis concentrated in affluent or high-traffic districts, leaving outer neighborhoods underserved. Digital dispatch can, in principle, reduce spatial bias, but driver incentives still favor short waits and dense demand. Some jurisdictions subsidize accessible and outer borough service, require minimum service levels, or used pooled services to raise vehicle utilization while expanding coverage. The goal is an inclusive taxi ecosystem that reaches the night worker, the elder, the wheelchair user, and the traveler outside the core. The green transformation of taxis is both symbolic and practical. As highly visible, high-mileage vehicles, taxis punch above their weight in urban emissions, converting them to hybrid and electric model yields outsized air quality and climate benefits. Early hybrid adoption proved that fuel saving could align with driver economics, while the latest purpose-built electric taxis offer increased cabin space, lower operating costs, and quiet operation that improves ride quality. The bottlenecks are predictable: charging infrastructure, uptime during charging windows, purchase price differentials, and residual values. Policy can smooth the path with incentives, depot charging at taxi ranks, and procurement standards that shift fleets in bulk. Over the next decade, the taxi's environmental identity may become as central as its color or shape, with charging hubs functioning as new taxi stands and software optimizing both rider matching and battery management. Autonomous taxi pilots have moved from concept to limited operation in a handful of cities, revealing both potential and constraints. Robotaxis can excel on well-mapped, geo-fenced routes enduring conditions that favor sensors and prediction. They can also, in theory, expand late-night or low-demand service without labor constraints. Yet autonomy must grapple with messy edge cases that human drivers routinely resolve, from curb etiquette to unexpected roadwork to the subtle social choreography of yielding and merging. The economics are delicate, capital costs are high, and utilization must be very strong to amortize expensive hardware and operations. In the near term, autonomy may complement rather than replace drivers operating in niche corridors, off-peak windows, or as feeder service to transit. Even in a more autonomous future, the human taxi driver may remain vital in complex neighborhoods for assisted mobility and in cities where local knowledge, judgment, and human presence are themselves part of the service being purchased. Taxis are cultural artifacts as much as transportation modes. They are cinematic stages, literary devices, and musical motifs. A cab can signal urgency, romance, chaos, or escape in a single shot. Drivers, meanwhile, carry the city's stories, overheard deals, late-night confessions, fragments of languages, and the practical intelligence that only comes from years on the road. The cab's cabin has hosted arguments and reconciliations, births en route to hospitals, and quiet moments of reflection between strangers. These narratives, though anecdotal, have real effects. They shape expectations, norms, and the informal rules that govern rider and driver behavior. When outsiders visit a city, a taxi ride is often their first immersive contact with local character. When residents are at their most vulnerable, a taxi can be the safest option home. The cultural life of the cab is thus inseparable from its economic and logistical roles. As cities adopt open data policies, taxis have become participants in civic analytics. Trip data sets, scrubbed for privacy, enable planners and researchers to understand demand patterns, curb conflicts, and model interchange with transit integration with public transport through unified payment, wayfinding, and first-last mile planning can position taxis as connective tissue rather than competitors. In many metropolitan regions, the strategic objective is not to pick winners between modes, but to orchestrate them. Buses and trains for trunks, bikes and sidewalks for hyper-local movement, and taxis and app hails for flexible coverage. This system's view reframes taxis as part of a mobility commons where service quality, emissions, congestion, and equity goals are managed at the network level rather than mode by mode. Periods of crisis reveal taxis' resilience. During transit strikes, severe weather, or sudden infrastructure failures, taxis often surge to fill gaps. In public health emergencies, they can support essential trips and delivery functions, sometimes repurposed by cities through vouchers or contracts to maintain access for essential workers and vulnerable populations. Because taxis are both distributed and coordinatable, they can pivot faster than large fixed route systems. Their resilience comes from a hybrid identity: small businesses linked by dispatch, regulated by entrepreneurial, and powered by drivers whose lived knowledge of their cities is itself an asset. The next chapter for taxis will be written at the intersections of governance, worker dignity, and design. Governance must reconcile dynamism with transparency, ensuring algorithmic meters are audible and that price signals serve riders and drivers rather than exploiting information asymmetries. Worker dignity requires stable earnings, fair dispute resolution, and pathways to asset ownership or skill development so that driving remains a viable and respected profession. Design of vehicles, curbs, apps, and data standards will determine whether the system is legible, accessible, and pleasant. Curbs, in particular, are the new frontier. They must accommodate pickups, deliveries, bikes, and outdoor life without chaos, and taxis need predictable access to serve well. At its best, the future taxi is electric, integrated, and humane, a quiet, clean vehicle that arrives when you need it, whose driver is fairly compensated or whose autonomy is responsibly governed, and whose place at the curb is thoughtfully planned. From 17th century hackneys to metered motor cars, from radio dispatch to platform matching, from diesel sedans to battery electric purpose-built cabs, the taxicab has continually adapted to the demands and ideals of city life. Its essence has not changed, a promise of personal mobility without ownership, bought journey by journey, under a social compact of safety and fairness. The details, colors, fares, regulations, apps will keep evolving, but as long as cities remain places where time is precious and movement is opportunity, there will be a need for taxis in some form. Their history is not a relic, it's a playbook for how to negotiate public goals and private initiative, how to design for dignity and efficiency, and how to make large, complex places feel navigable, one ride at a time.